Welcome to Safety Talk. Personal safety expert Pete Canavan shares his insights and interviews experts who provide simple and effective tips, techniques, and technologies to keep you safe and secure both online and off. Here's Pete.
Hello, and welcome to another informative episode of Safety Talk. I am your host and personal safety expert, Pete Canavan, and I am joined by my colleague, branding and social media expert, Neil Haley. How you doing today, Neil? I'm
doing fantastic, Pete. Always great to Mondays finally become great when we know we're going to be together. It's before that, the hard day, especially daylight savings, but now, hey, we got through it, and it's Monday night, and we made it through that first day, right? That's a challenge.
That's all right. Yeah. Well, hey, I always make my Mondays the long days, so it makes the rest of the week easy. So first, what we're going to do is, we're going to be introducing our guest in a minute, but just wanted to touch base real quick on some of the safety news this past week, because one of the things we talk about in the show is, your personal safety and all the different things that can affect your personal safety. And unfortunately, here in the United States and Alabama, this past week, we had an absolutely terrible tragedy related to severe weather. There were two back-to-back tornadoes in Alabama last week, and they claimed the lives of 23 people and absolutely completely obliterated the town of Beauregard. So, it's just one more thing to think about, that, our personal safety is something that we always, I think in many cases, take for granted. And I'm sure that the people there in Beauregard, Alabama, really were thinking that, even with a tornado warning that, it's going to be a tornado, maybe it'll be bad, maybe it's not. But I'm sure the people that lost their lives never thought that that was going to happen to them. So, that's one of the things that I always talk about, is the risk that severe weather brings to your personal safety. A few weeks back on a previous episode, we were talking about the risk of major snowstorms and severe cold. And, so this recent example just illustrates all too well the need to understand the risks to your safety that exist where you live, where you work, where you go to school, etc.
Exactly.
So if you live anywhere where there's a risk of severe weather, whether it's fires, floods, tornadoes, etc., that risk can sometimes become a really nasty reality. So that's a perfect segue into today's topic. And, this week we've got another incredible guest for you. And our guest on today's show is a gentleman by the name of John Verspasian. And he's the author of 10 books and has lived in several countries, including Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and recently he is actually in the Netherlands, which is where he's joining us from today. So being able to travel around the world has allowed John to accumulate a worldwide perspective on many topics, including how to thrive during challenges, during difficult times, and through disruptions. And he's written books about rational living and stress relief and becoming unbreakable, which is something I love because I'm always talking about the warrior mindset and how to use that to persevere. So in today's fast-paced world, stressful world, these are all important topics for discussion. So welcome to Safety Talk, John, and thanks for being on the show.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for having me on.
We're real glad you could make it on the show today. I know it's very early in the morning for you there in the Netherlands. So I know how tough that can be to get up early, but we appreciate that. Now, something else that's really tough is writing a book, let alone 10 books. Now, I've written 5 so far, and you doubled that. And, I've got some more in me, and I'm sure you've got some more in you. But I guess when you really know your subject matter, it's not, that terribly tough. And, I'm kind of interested. Have you found that to be true as well?
It's always tough. It's always requiring discipline to get down to writing. What I do is to be extremely organized because I know I cannot just put it off. Unless you do it every day, unless you do it every week, it's very difficult to produce one book per year.
Yes, and you mentioned to me before we got started that's your goal. A book a year is...
Wow. How do you keep yourself organized to keep writing and cranking out books?
I work backwards in the sense that when people write books, most of the time they will just figure out what to do, and then they will research, and then they will write. I work backwards in the sense that I read a lot, I take notes, I travel. I have material now for at least another dozen books. And I'm taking notes all the time and organizing notes. And when I want to write the next book, the research and the subject is already done. I just have to write it. So in a sense that I don't need a lot of creativity because I'm just doing research all the time.
So they write themselves. So you start from the end of the book. So I assume that means that whatever you're wanting, whatever answer you want the book, or whatever question you want the book to answer, that's where you begin and then work backwards from there?
Yes, but I always write stories. My books, they all have the same structure. They are based on history. They're based on real people, biographies. What I do in each book is to go through a series of stories and to draw practical lessons that people can apply in their own lives today. The latest book, which is called Undisrupted, is about how to deal with disruptions in your own life. It's based on real stories. Just tell you the story that gave me the idea for the book. I was reading the biography of a Russian industrialist. His name is Sava Mamontov. He was very wealthy, not very well known outside Russia, but in the 19th century, he was one of the major European industrialists. And the biography is super interesting because this guy, in his 40s, he was king of the world. He was building railroads from Moscow to the east, a celebrity on all newspapers, and then he destroyed his life. I found the story super intriguing. He was very intelligent, very well educated, but he made a series of mistakes. He started other businesses. He wanted to expand, something that very often people will do. So he started to build steel mills, thinking that his management ability would allow him to do anything in life. And he made some mistakes. He started to lose money. He panicked. This is something that goes through all the stories of people who are wiped out by disruption. He panicked. He started to cover the losses in one company with the cash flow from the other company. His shareholders found out. He was sued, and he lost everything. They filed criminal charges against him. He was put on trial. He was on the newspapers for 6 months on the front page every day because he was one of the top celebrities in Russia. And he lost everything. His friends wouldn't talk to him. People would just cross the street, not just to avoid Mamontov. And he spent the last 17 years of his life in total misery. And I found the typical story of what you want to avoid in life. You want to avoid this kind of disruptions. You want to avoid these kind of situations where everything you have, your health, your money, your friends, you lose everything. So I wrote a book about this subject, story after story, what you should do and what you should refrain from doing.
The book has an interesting title, The Undisrupted, How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. And so, you wrote an entire book on this, but, it's kind of maybe a tough question to answer, or maybe not. But what would you say is the key to dealing effectively with disruptions? Because, so many people today have a million things that disrupt our lives, whether it's something with work or at home or school or our kids, and so that's something that I think everybody can really take some value away from, is your insights there.
Yeah. Well, there are several ideas in the book. I go through them in detail, but if I just give you one of the key ideas, one thing that you should always do when you're dealing with disruptions, with problems, adversity, sickness, is to react always from your strengths, not improvise. Never improvise. You have to see when you have a business problem, don't go into a business you don't know anything about. If you have routines or you are disrupted in your family or your interests, don't improvise. Build on something you already know. Build on your skills. Build on people who already know you. Build on your business. And let me just give you quickly an example, and which was also one of the key ideas I developed in the book. Is a story of a lawyer. His name was Kovalevsky. He was very well known in the early 20th century because he was the first person in history who figured out how from small horses. You see when you go to a museum, a museum of history, you see these fossils of small horses. They're all around North America. They're in South America. They're also in Europe. But until the 19th century, until Kowalewski, nobody had figured out how these very small horses, I'm talking the size of a cat, became the huge horses we have today. And it was a mystery. People actually thought that they were two different species. And Kowalewski was the first person to figure out how it happened. And it happened through disruptions. It happened because these small horses used to live in the woods. They used to eat leaves. And eventually the trees, due to change in climatic change, they started to grow. They could not eat leaves, so they have to go outside, have to go into the prairie. And it was very dangerous. There were very big cats eating the horses, running around the horses. And they started to run faster. They started to become bigger because they have to deal with disruptions. They have to survive.
Right.
And this running and surviving, each generation grew a little bit bigger. And a little bit bigger because they have to escape. Those who could not run would die. And those who could run, they would reproduce and become even bigger. And it took a few thousand years, but thanks to their strengths, because they were building on they could do, they could escape and they could survive. And it's a very important lesson. Always rely on your strengths, rely on your assets. Do not improvise like Mamontov did. Do not improvise because you will be most likely wiped out.
Well, so in so many ways, we have to learn that we can't eliminate distractions. We have to learn to deal with them. And we have to be able to identify when they happen. It sounds like what you're saying.
Yes, okay. Many times you will not be able to figure out because, life is complex. You can, to a certain extent, if you have good advisors, you can figure out 99%. There will always be something that nobody could figure out, some economic disruption, some major, I don't know, whatever, and then you're on your own. And the whole purpose of the book is to give you the principles, to give you the ideas that you can always use to survive, even in situations that nobody could have foreseen.
Yeah, and, there are, sort of a little bit of natural selection going on there too, but obviously, like you said, they play to their strengths. And I think that's very good advice for people, especially when, when you're dealing with, some turbulent and, times that are filled with sort of turmoil, which I think today's world, we are seeing that more and more where, in times like that, almost like where the horses had to survive, this show's all about safety and, to survival to a certain extent as well. So in these times that we're living through right now, is it possible for individuals to sort of do the same thing as you talk about in that example with the horses, where they, how do they protect themselves? How do they evolve?
Yes, it is possible. Let me just give you an example because these principles, okay, they are very nice to hear, but it's not self-evident how to apply them in real life. So let me just give you an example. Look, one of the major personalities in the 1950s and 60s was Albert Schweitzer. He was a theologian. He was working in university. He was giving courses. He changed his life completely because he wanted to become a missionary in Africa. He got the idea because he was very unhappy with his life. He was in his 30s and he was teaching at the university and he wanted to become a real Christian. For him, it was a driver his whole life. And also he was very unhappy because his life was disconnected. He was a guy who in the morning would teach theoretical theology, and in the evening, he was a passionate musician. He would play Bach, he would play the organ in the cathedral. And he had these two sides. On the one side, he was very intellectual. On the other side, very passionate, very creative. And he was very unhappy. The guy was going through very difficult times. How he decided from one day to the next, I'm going to Africa, I'm going to become a missionary, which was incredible. I mean, it means completely disrupting his own life to a way, in an extent that very few people will do, especially when you're already well established. So the guy went looking for a job as a missionary. He applied and he was rejected because they told him, look, what are you going to do in Africa? You have no skills. You're a professor. You will not be able to do anything. So he went back and he quit his job and he went to study medicine He enrolled in the Faculty of Medicine. He was already in his mid-30s. He quit his job. He studied medicine for 4 years, and then he came back and said, now I am a physician. I can work in Africa. And they told him, okay, we give you a chance. So he went to Africa. He married a woman who was in line with his ideas. And the disruption he went was amazing. Almost impossible to survive for most people. But he did one thing that, and this I want to underline because it's super intelligent strategy. When he went to Africa, and you have to imagine it took a week just to get there. I mean, it was really amazing. And he took with him a second-hand piano. And this is something that very few people know about Schweitzer. But he was a very clever guy. He thought, look, if everything fails, if I go to Africa and it's a complete disaster, if I don't like it, I can always go back to my music. Because he could not go back to his job, but he could always make a living playing in the church. He was a very good organist. And he thought, but if I lose my skills...
You can fall back on one of his strengths, right?
Yeah. Then he took this piano, a second-hand piano, a very cheap upright piano. He took it to Africa, and when he was there, starting his hospital, he would play every day for an hour to keep his skills. When he ran out of money, he went back to Europe, and he played in cathedrals. He played the organ for a few months. He raised money, and he went back to Africa. And thanks to this backup plan, just by keeping his skills to a high level, he was able to fund his hospital through difficult times. And he did all his life. He continued to play Sundays, Mondays, Tuesday, every day, sitting in the middle of the savannah where there are only lions and whatever, and people just staring at him and say, what is this guy doing? He was playing the piano every day to keep the skill. And this is something, a very important lesson. If you want to stay safe, keep your systems going every day. Even if it looks like a waste of time, think of Schweitzer. This guy was super clever. He went to Africa, but he played the piano every day. It looks completely out of place, but this kept his life very safe because at certain times he could not stay in Africa. He had to go back, and he always had a source of income.
Interesting. Okay, I was wondering how we're going to tie that in. So
right. Yes,
that was good.
Definitely, yeah.
Well, and it's an example that people will hopefully remember, because we all have skills that we don't fully utilize because we don't see the need for them, because there is maybe no as in Schweitzer's instance no immediate need, but yet it's something that we need to practice and we need to be stay sharp with, and that is true in everybody's lives in dealing with adversity and dealing with things that can potentially occur to them. But, they may and they may not, but you know what? It's a little bit of insurance policy that you can, take on, but with yourself to ensure that there are things that will allow you to persist and survive if there is some major problem. So, it's very interesting. Now, people that have survived major adversities in their life, what are some lessons that maybe we can learn from that? Just that sort of similar takeaway, would you say there, John?
Well, let me just tell you a little story to explain the principle, because this is absolutely not self-evident. When people have severe adversity, are facing severe problems, we all get very stressed, very emotional. Sometimes we panic. And we think, okay, there's no solution. I'm going to die. It is terrible. I lost everything. And I found from the stories in the book, one of the ones that really deals with this problem is the story of Django Reinhardt. He was a guitar player, a very famous guitar player in the 1940s, 1930s. And when he was at the beginning of his career, he was a gypsy. He was living in one of these traveling cars. There was no electricity, so they used candles. And during the night, a candle was upturned and the car burned. So the guy was sleeping and he woke up and he could not get out. He suffered severe burnings. He lost one of his fingers. For a guitar player, this is basically the end of the career. To play guitar with... But Reinhardt had no choice. He wanted to make money as a gypsy. He had no alternative. He had no education. He had no connections. He only knew how to play the guitar. That's how he made a living. This happens in situations where people say, okay, I have no choice. What the hell I'm going to do? And he came with a very interesting insight because everybody told him, look, give up, you never make it. And he thought, okay, maybe I can find a solution. And there you have the principle. And when you have these kind of situations that they look impossible to solve because there is no precedent. I mean, nobody in history had actually solved this problem. What you have to do is to look at similar situations, look at similar bankruptcies, similar sickness, similar injuries, and see how people can solve the problem. And then Reinhardt looked at different situations. Maybe he could adapt the guitar. And in the end, he came up with a solution. He said, maybe I can play faster. If I play faster, I could make up for one finger less if I play 25% faster. And he trained for 6 months with this logic. And it was logical because he saw examples of different people who have solved problems by just doing things a little bit faster. And he played, and after 6 months, he was able to play very, very fast. And when you listen to Reinhardt, one of his records, it's amazing because nobody can play like this. The guy who was able to play gypsy music, he became extremely famous, very wealthy. He traveled through the US. In France, he was a great celebrity in Belgium. And he had a very nice life. Just because he figured out how to solve a big problem, how to deal with a disruption by copying something that people have been doing for similar situations. So you can always find in history many solutions, many examples. When you're dealing with huge disruptions, try to find inspiration in similar stories because you will never find someone exactly with the same problem, but you can always find similarities.
Sure.
Now, when I hear you talk about this, in a lot of ways, you're saying that from our mistakes, we learn those examples to take with us. So it's investigation a lot when we have these distractions around us and different things and how to deal with certain things and with adversity, and kind of it's, learn from the mistakes, keep trying, retry different things and move forward till you finally get it. And it's a trial and error and an investigation and scientific thing in a lot of ways. We need to live our lives.
Is that why
you
encourage your readers to embrace certain kinds of disruptions? Because it forces them to sort of fall back on their strengths and to come out the other side, stronger?
Sometimes you have no choice. If you're in a situation where you're stuck and you have, a sickness or you lost your job or whatever, you have to go through disruptions. You have no choice. And you have to explore different possibilities. You have to try to find solutions. And you have to motivate yourself to do that. And this is a very important aspect because go back to the situation I was speaking about this Reinhardt guy who was burned. And he was actually in hospital for several months. How do you motivate yourself in this situation where it seems completely hopeless? And this is why I recommended the book. Find similar situations where people recovered because they will inspire you. They will show you it is possible. Even if it's not exactly the same situation, you can find solutions that will bring you back to safety because you say, this guy did it, I can do it. Otherwise, it's very difficult to find motivation because then you say, okay, it's impossible. It's impossible. I will never be able to do it. But this Reinhardt, he found examples and he had a logic because in the end, you say, okay, if I do it faster, it should work. And it works.
Yeah, there are always things that when we're of strong mind and we step back and we think for a minute, you know what? There's always someone else who has it worse than me. He maybe lost a finger. Somebody else might have lost a hand or an arm. So if you take whatever is affecting you in your life and sort of extrapolate it out, you can really start to put things in perspective, like, you complain that you got to put your car in the shop because, you need new tires. Well, be glad you don't have to walk 5 miles to work every day, that you have a car. So we can take some of the problems that we have that maybe annoy us a little bit more than they should and begin to put them in perspective. And I think that helps us mentally and physically and emotionally sort of get past the things that could otherwise be, obstacles that may, be a little bit more severe, but it starts to cross our minds that we maybe, should give up. And so, that's something that we can't do. We have to always think, look, it could always be worse. No matter how bad it is, it could always be worse. I mean, the only thing that, the worst thing is, when you're dead and you're gone. I mean, then there's nothing worse than that, right? But up until that point, there are always things that we can do to get us to the other side. And, that's something that I like about that story, because, he took something that was a potential, sort of death sentence for him with his career as a musician and a guitar player. And he figured out a way to turn that into something positive. And that's a fantastic thing. Now,
yeah, that's what we have to do. And now you mentioned positive thinking. I just want to make a qualification because nowadays, I mean, the 21st century seems to be the century of this positive thinking and the law of attraction and these kind of ideas. You have to be a bit careful with that. When the first, let me just tell you a little story about this positive thinking in the times of disruption, because the principle is super important. Look, the first person who came with these ideas of being positive and trying to solve problems this way was Émile Coué. He was a pharmacist living in France in the 19th century. He studied. He was a person very modest background. He went to university. He got a degree, and he established a small pharmacy in a town in France. He wanted to improve his business, but he didn't know how. He tried different things, did nothing work. And eventually he saw an advertisement in a newspaper about a course on hypnotism. I thought, oh, this looks very interesting. And it was in another town, so he had to think how to do it, because he had to close down his business for a couple of weeks just to attend this course. Eventually he saved some money. He went to this course about hypnotism. He found it very interesting, and he went back, reopened the business, and thought, okay, how can I use it? How can I use it? And he started something unique in history, this positive thinking trend, because he started to apply positive suggestion and visualization on his patients. So when somebody went to his pharmacy, basically to buy herbal preparations, he would sell chamomile preparation, sage, this kind of preparations. He told them, you are going to get well. If you take this twice a day, after 2 weeks, you'll be fine. People, they came back 2 weeks later and say, wow, it worked. And why did it work? It was not the suggestion. It was
their mind,
the reinforcement. Because when people got convinced that it was going to work, they got motivated to do it. And they would take the medicine, the preparation, very religiously twice a day. They would never miss it, because they know, this guy told me it's going to work. And this guy was a pharmacist, was a scientist. He was making statistics, and he saw, oh, this is amazing, it works. People recover much faster. Sure. He became very famous. People would go hundreds of kilometers just to go to this pharmacy. Within a few years, the guy retired very wealthy, because he discovered how to use positive thinking. And this is the idea, very important. Use positive thinking to reinforce good habits, not for fantasy. This guy was telling people, take the herbal preparation and you will well. He didn't tell them it's magic. It's not magic. You have to put the action together with the positive thinking.
Right. Well, and that's an interesting sort of segue, because
definitely. I wanted before question Pete about this whole law of attraction and what his belief in this whole law of attraction thing is before we get to the next question. That's going to
I've done a lot of training on this.
So I want to give you your take on the law of attraction. I honestly believe in anything in life, you're going to be a negative person, you're going to run into negative things. I mean, that's not common sense, because in your mind, you're already saying you're not going to succeed. But what is your thought on the law of attraction?
I've done tons of training on the law of attraction. It's absolutely real. I've attracted things to myself. I could tell you stories, you wouldn't believe it. I attracted my house to myself. I attracted my Corvette to myself. I attracted all kinds of things to myself over the years. And a lot of it has to do with putting out that positive energy and being focused with passion and emotion on what it is that you're looking to achieve. And then you have to let go and let the universe bring it to you. And that's the law of attraction in a nutshell. And I've done hours and hours of training on this, many, many trainings on the law of attraction for different companies. And because it works. And just like this guy who is talking about, in John's story, there's a huge amount of power in the human mind. And if you have belief, which is what these people had that were coming to the pharmacy, that what this guy is telling you, because he's an expert, he's a pharmacist, he's a scientist, he knows what he's talking about, then that belief and that strong emotion within that person would probably have even brought about those results if they didn't even take the medication, because the body has the power to heal itself. So there's a lot of things going on. I could talk about that for a long time, but that's my take on the whole thing, because it definitely works, you know. Fun stuff. Now, John, why in your book do you warn against prophets of doom? Wouldn't you say that today, with all of the negativity out in the world, that, you know, the pessimism is kind of justified out there today? It's hard to us to be positive and think positively and attract things to ourselves, like, you know, that we want.
Yes, but okay. Every time you open the newspapers, it seems the world is coming to the end.
Good point.
It's very easy. I mean, if you consume a lot of media, a lot of news, it's very easy to become negative, to become despairing, to become passive, because that's part of the business. I mean, if you run a media enterprise, you want to make things that are sensational. People get hooked on the news. You always talking about catastrophes. You have to be careful with this. This makes you very vulnerable because you become passive, you become scared, you start to give up and say, okay, there's nothing I can do, I'm going to be destroyed, I lose everything. And this mentality is widespread. In the 21st century, where people spend a huge amount of time on social media and on consuming news and this kind of stuff, you can very easily get hooked on the negative aspect of things, and you have to realize that most of the time the news are exaggerated.
Sure.
I live in Europe, where it happens every few weeks that there's some new catastrophe, some new threat, some new story, and in the end you look at it in perspective and say, look, come on, this is a joke. I mean, nothing really happened, but don't get scared. Don't overconsume this kind of media. There are too many prophets of doom giving you completely exaggerated views of the world. It's much better to be practical, to be realistic, to try to stay safe, to adopt measures to protect yourself instead of becoming scared.
And protect, like you just said, protect your mind. Like, I don't read the newspaper, because everything from the first headline to the last is all about negativity. It's about crime. It's about negative politics. It's about things that are sensational that are put out there to sell papers, because bad news sells. Catastrophes sell. You know, these things are what sells newspapers. And it's really sad, because the number of positive articles that you find in any periodical or on any news program, on television for that matter, is minuscule. I mean, you have to really search and dig to actually find something that's positive. And that's a really interesting point, John, is that it's poisoning people's minds. It's putting some fear in them. They're afraid of things. They're wondering, oh, why is all this happening? You know, what's going on in the world? And it's a poison, I feel, that is unfortunately being perpetrated by so many out there in the media, and they're doing it to sensationalize the news in such a way that it's going to sell more papers or get more people to watch their shows. And so if you replaced even just a portion of that negative, you know, information that we're being bombarded with all the time, whether it's from the news or from social media or from whatever, with positive books, you know, books on life and love and attraction and success and health and wealth, those are the things that you're going to begin to attract to yourself way more than if you're not ever dealing with them, if you're not feeding your mind with them, because it's, you know, we are what we think about, and we are what we focus on. That's what we become. And it's a really strange and scary cycle that we're seeing. And I see it getting worse, and I'm sure you do as well.
Yes, to a certain extent, it's sad to see people give up. It's not only happening in the US. You see many people unemployed, trying to survive. But if you concentrate on building your skills, building your systems, having always a backup plan, 99% of the situation are going to be solved. Let me just give you an example from history. which is very dramatic. But I think it will just drive the point home. Look, in the 14th century, 11th, 12th, 13th century, there was a military organization which was extremely powerful. It was the Templars, the Night Templars. There are a lot of movies about the Night Templars.
Yes.
For 200 years, they dominated Western Europe. They have castles, they had land, they had gold. And few people know that they disappear overnight. The story is very intriguing, but it's a fact, a historical fact. They got some conflicts with the king of France. He wanted to take away their money. What he did, the king, what he did was to trump up some charges, some false charges against the leaders. He arrested a few of them. It was like not many. I mean, like 10 people. He arrested them. He prosecuted, and then he had them burned at the stake in France. Now the question is, you kill 10 people. 10 people out of an organization, 20,000 people, very wealthy, very sophisticated, the best of the best in Europe. You kill 10 people. How is it possible that the organization completely collapsed and they disappear from history after having all this? I found it very intriguing, very interesting from the point of view of self-protection. And the answer is the following. The warriors, the Night Templars, they were organized, but the fighting power was actually small because they have 2,000 warriors. They were heavily armored, very well trained, but the other 18,000 was overhead. They had all this organization, all this logistics, all this stuff, but they could not actually fight. They have these 2,000 people that were very strong, but they were spread all over Europe. They could not just put together an army and go and basically take over France, because it would have been easy with 20,000 people. But the problem is that they had a huge overhead. They were not prepared to deal with disruptions. If they had had a backup plan with a deputy manager to take over immediately, they could have taken over France easily. The problem is that they were spread all over. They were having a huge overhead, and eventually they killed 10 people and they destroyed the Night Templars overnight. They collapsed totally and completely. And this is a very important lesson in your business life, in your family life. Always have a situation which is stable. You can fall back, keep it organized. Don't run operations in an ineffective way, because then you become extremely vulnerable.
Absolutely. No, it makes perfect sense. You got to have a backup plan. You don't have a backup plan and something happens to plan A, you're done. Right.
So planning's important, it sounds like, what I'm hearing. I completely think it's important, but what about on your end? You think that's part of you're talking about these distractions is planning for the future, planning for daily. You can't just sit there and just say whatever will be. That's not going to work.
Certainly, and I give a lot of examples how to prepare yourself, how to take different measures. The whole thing that is behind is the mindset. When you have success and you have a very nice life, it's very difficult to motivate yourself to have a backup plan. It's very difficult to motivate yourself to say, what happens if I lose my money in the stock market? What happens if I get sick? Well, it's very difficult, because when we are positive, we're positive, and we think nothing can happen to us. We will go on forever, our success, and this is very unrealistic. And this is why I try to explain in the book, it will happen to you. Sooner or later, you will have to deal with major disruption. You have to deal with adversity. It might not be your fault, but you have to be ready. You have to develop the mentality. You have to develop the tools to protect yourself. Otherwise, you might end up like Mamontov, losing everything, and this is far from ideal.
So what factors do you think are making people so sort of vulnerable today?
Yeah, what many people don't realize is that you have to prevent trouble before it happens. And if you have this mentality of continuity, which I think is the key factor that makes people vulnerable. If you think, as it is natural to us, to human beings, to think that everything is going to continue in the same way, you become very vulnerable. And this is something that in the 21st century is overemphasized. You look at the news, you read the newspapers, they develop trends. They develop the idea, which is very appealing, that you have one trend and it's going to continue for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. This is extremely unrealistic. And this is why
with our routines, that's why routines are so dangerous.
Yeah, this is why if you have routines, you need routines that are clever, that are well designed, but don't fall into this mentality of linearity that say, okay, everything is going to be fine. My life is going to continue smoothly in this direction, because you are fooling yourself. You need to prepare for disruptions. You need to have backup plan. You need to have savings. You need to have, if possible, different sources of income, because this will render you practically invulnerable.
And that's a great point. Some people have jobs, they lose their job. What do they do next? If they have their own business and then they are relying on a specific stream of income and they don't try to expand to other streams, when things can change, you miss out. So you got to constantly look at opportunities and weigh them, right? And see, is this going to make me money? What should I spend my time on? But I should spend my time on a variety of things, not just one, as you talked about in the story about the person who had to learn another skill set just to keep practicing that skill.
Yeah, this is super important. I would like just to add another idea that I think is also super helpful. And I got this idea from a chess player. His name was Capablanca. He was a Cuban chess player. He lived in the US most of his life. And he became very famous at the beginning of the 20th century. He was very famous in the 1920s, 1930s. And he used to play simultaneous games. I don't know if you have seen this in real life. It's very impressive. Huh? You see a grandmaster, and he goes into a room. He's surrounded by about 100 different players and different chess boards. He goes around the room. He makes a move on each board, and then he basically goes around 40 times, and he wins most of the games. I mean, these grandmasters, Capablanca used to win 98%. It was very impressive. And the question is, how could he deal with so many different situations, surprises, because he had to move basically in 10 seconds. He had to make a decision in 10 seconds, situations that sometimes they got very tricky. And how did he do it? I mean, he was obviously a very experienced chess player, but most of the grandmasters are not very good at simultaneous games. Capablanca was exceptional. He could win systematically 98%. He would go around the US with the sponsors, and he would play in hotels, and he would make a lot of money, and people would go to see Casablanca play. And how he did do it. And this is super important when you're dealing with disruptions. Capablanca gave a very clever advice and said, look, when you're dealing with situations that are very tricky, very complex, and you have to decide within 10 seconds what to do, and this happens when you're dealing with a crisis, in the end, it's very easy to find a solution. You have to think about the end game. And Casablanca was able to see, in a very complex chess situation, he was always able to see the structure, what is behind, what is going to happen in 10 moves, 20 moves, 30 moves. He would simplify the situation and see the end game. The end game is the key to be able to save yourself in very critical situations. To say, what will happen? I have 10 seconds to decide. I have 10 seconds to make a decision, like Capablanca had when he was playing simultaneous games. He would look at the end game. He would look at the structure. And sometimes he would make very uninspiring moves, because what he was just doing is to reinforce his position to be very strong in the end game. So when you're dealing with disruptions and you have to make a decision very quickly, try to simplify the factors, to simplify the parameters, and think of the end game, because most of the time you will come very quickly to a good decision.
And if you have that, end game and end goal in mind, you will also subconsciously begin to make the decisions that will bring you to that end result. And that's what's powerful about being able to visualize that end result, whether it's in business, in life, in relationships, and whatever. If you can visualize where it is that you want to go, and you've got that clearly defined, everything else you do in your life begins to consciously and subconsciously, you begin to make decisions that are going to bring you there. And that's why visualization is so powerful. And that's essentially what this guy was doing. He was visualizing what he wanted out of the end of the game, and then everything was taking him towards the realization of that successful goal. And that's very interesting, because that's something that is something necessary in being successful, is knowing where you're going. If you don't know where you're going, you're just a ship without a compass. You're out in the middle of the ocean floating around. You don't know where you're going. You've got to know, where's land, where am I going, what's my destination, and how am I going to get there? And you better have a compass that shows you the way.
Yeah, and it takes discipline to develop this kind of skill. I find reading stories very interesting, because you can draw examples, you can draw lessons from the examples, but I'm also realistic. It takes sometimes months, sometimes a year to develop these habits, this mentality. But okay, it's worth it. I mean, unless you put yourself to do it, to doing that, it's not natural. Human beings, we tend to become very short-term oriented. Sometimes we make a mess because we make contradictory decisions. And what was amazing of Capablanca, when you see his games, his chess games, the guy, you have to realize that he was coming from Cuba. I mean, he was a very a different background. He came to the US when he was already in his 20s. So it was not that he got from the very beginning to know the culture. He had to adapt. But he had this mentality, developed his mentality as a child, to focus on the essential, to focus on the end game, to be always simplifying. And he developed this mentality that even when he was under heavy competition, because the best chess players in the world, they were in the US at the time, a few in Russia. The guy also traveled to Europe, traveled to Russia, traveled to the UK. And whenever he went, he applied his system, and it always worked. He was always able to stay on top. He won many chess tournaments around the world just by using this principle and always focusing on the end game.
That's awesome. Now, one of the things that we want to look at is being not just successful, but in order to be happy and to be safe, it requires different things to for us to focus on in our lives. And one of the things you talk about in this new book is going back to nature. And a lot of people say, well, let's kind of go back to nature and that'll help us sort of get in touch with ourselves and that sort of thing. So you're very skeptical of that concept. Maybe you could kind of tell me why you're skeptical is kind of going back to nature is not really a good way as a recipe for us to be happy.
Yes, because during the research, I mean, I started a bit also with the same conviction, say, okay, going back to nature is now a big fashion. But the research did not prove it. Actually, I got many examples against that. I didn't find one single example of anyone solving a disruption by going back to nature. And this is because we tend to romanticize a lot what is going back to nature. I mean, if you really go and live in a very primitive environment without running water, electricity, could be fun for a couple of days, but this is not the way to solve any problem. I mean, it's a bit romantic. It has an emotional connotation of purity and simplicity, but don't fool yourself. I mean, this is not going to solve any problem. It's very good.
Very extreme too. It's an extreme way to sort of deal with problems and think that it's going to get easier. You're going to be happy if you just sort of unplug and that's it.
So when you talk about following these principles, what things can listeners that are not in the mindset of planning all the time and looking at improving on certain skill sets and really try every day to move the needle in a direction that's going to be in a more positive, organized fashion. What do you recommend our listeners do? One good tip to start in this process? Well,
if you don't know exactly what to do, and then you say, okay, I want to become safer, but I don't know what, just do one thing. Diversify your sources of income, diversify your investment, diversify your types of friends. Even if you can learn another language, because it will open millions of possibilities, diversify. Try not to put all your skills or all your friends or all your finances, all your investment in one basket. It seems very simple. It's totally counterintuitive, because when people do something well, they want to do it all the time. But eventually you will be blocked. You will be facing disruptions. You find this in history all the time. Diversification, segmentation, breaking things down to avoid risk, to diversify your suppliers, to diversify your customers, to diversify your audience. It takes work. It is counterintuitive. It is annoying. But if you want to stay safe, it's 100% sure fire recipe. It always works. Diversification is natural. But if you see in history, the cultures that have survived, they were always very well diversified. When they had a drought, when they could not use some kind of crop, they used another one. When they could not eat one thing, they ate another thing, but they survived because they were able to diversify and to adapt.
And that applies to so many different things. I mean, to finances, to health, to wealth, multiple streams of income, multiple sources of income. And it makes total sense, because if you, as you say, you put all your eggs in one basket and somebody steals that basket, you got a big problem. So that's some very good advice for everybody, I think, because we all do get comfortable, and we tend to, I think, a lot of times get lazy. If things are going just fine, we expect them to go fine, and they're never going to change. But unfortunately, life has a way of throwing us a curveball once in a while. And if we're not ready to see that curveball coming, it's going to take us by surprise. And depending on what it is, it could end up costing us dearly, either in our health or our wealth, or ultimately our lives.
Yeah, the principles that you apply to stay safe, you can use them also for many other areas. You can use it in project management. You can use it in business development. Let me just give you a short example that shows you that the mentality can be used to your benefit in any circumstances. Look, one of the stories I address in the book is how people built cathedrals in the Middle Ages. If you go to Europe, you will find these Gothic cathedrals. They're amazing. They're super high. And you have to realize that at that time in history, it was very cold in the Middle Ages. It was the winter was extremely cold. People were very small. They were 5 feet. That was the average height in Europe. And how could they actually build these cathedrals when they have to deal with an amazing number of disruptions? They had the weather. Logistics was very difficult. There were, of course, no cars. They have to move the stones one by one. They have to cut the stones. They have to design the whole thing. Like, people could not read instructions. Nobody could read. So it was really a huge amount of disruption. And in the end, they built the cathedrals. How did they do it? How could you actually learn from them? And it was only one guy, Suger. His name was Suger. He was an abbot in a monastery in France. He figured out how to do it. Until the 11th centuries. The technology was known how to build these buildings, but nobody had put it together because it looked impossible. It looked there are so many disruptions, so many obstacles. And Suger figured out how to do it. And the principle is super interesting because you can apply it in your life or in your business very easily. So Suger figured out that he has to deal with all these problems. He has also a limited budget. He thought, okay, how can I figure out a system that always works, that allows me to put together this cathedral relatively quickly without disruptions. So what Suger did was to figure out a working system that could deal with any disruption. And he put together a team of masons and carpenters. They built houses, wooden houses around the site. He was able to have people working full-time all through the year despite disruption. And he figured out that, okay, in the winter we cannot work outside, so we are going to work inside. So they got the stones, and he spent the winter in the houses cutting the stones. And then during the summer, they went outside, they put the stones from the cathedral, they built a couple of meters, and then they went back to the winter, and they went back to the stones, and they continued to cut stones. So all through the year, he kept people working smoothly, and this is the key. If you find a way to work smoothly, despite disruptions, you can put up cathedrals, you can build great businesses, you can do anything, but you have to think ahead. This guy, Sugier, he was well-read for his time. He had traveled, he had seen a lot of things, and he came with this idea that allowed him to build the cathedrals in 10 years. It is very short, 10 years to build a huge building with very low technology. And what they did when he built his first cathedral was Saint Denis in France. People went to see it and they were amazed. How did you do it? And eventually they copy-pasted his technology, and they built cathedrals around France. So all the cathedrals in France, they look pretty much the same, and they are all copied from this guy, Sugier. And today in the 21st century, we can copy the principle, figure out how to do things smoothly so that you can always continue to advance, you can always continue to work, even if it's too cold, even if you don't have enough stones, you have to figure out the system to do it. If you give up because it's too cold, because it's too far away, because people cannot read, whatever, you are not thinking hard enough. Sugier was able to do it in the 11th century. I mean, you have to realize the level of technology was ridiculous, and they built these cathedrals. Today, you can do much better.
Especially, the 21st century, we should be able to do that. So that's awesome. John, if people are interested in picking up your books, where can our listeners find a copy of your latest book, Undisrupted, and as well as your other books?
Well, super easy to find. If you type my name on Google, John Verspasian, you will find my books, my website, my free newsletter. You'll find everything in 1 second. The name is very unusual. Even if you misspell it, doesn't matter. Google will point you out to my stuff. It's available in Amazon, in the Apple web store, in the Apple store. It's very easy to find. Just type John Verspasian. You will find everything in 1 second.
And that's VES. Let's see here. How we spell your name here, John, just so people have VESPASIAN, because you cannot hide from Google. It will find you. So thanks so much for being on the show, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in here. And don't forget, you can get the more information as well as the latest news about safety at safetytalkpodcast.com for other episodes. And we'll see you on our next week's show. We've got another exciting guest. We'll be talking about crisis communications. Should be a very interesting show. So until next time, stay safe. I'm Pete Canavan, and we'll talk to you soon.